So one of the things I wanted to talk about here, so I don't know if we've talked about this book before. This was, of course, at one time we were doing the cybernetics meetings almost every week, and we were making ties to cognition and cognition futures and cognitive science. And we talked about Heinz von Forester, of course, who is a cyberneticist who had a lab at the University of Illinois called the uh, biological systems lab or something like that. And of course, that was closed in the 70s sometime. And the building it was in is now like a little quad, in front of the engineering library. But the inspiration for that lives on in some of the work that he did. So this is a book that he wrote well after that lab closed. It's called Understanding Understanding. And as rhetorical as that seems, it's actually about sort of this higher level cybernetics where we get out to second order and third order cybernetics. We get to observers and all this stuff. So there's some interesting stuff in this book. I want to focus on one chapter here. And that is this chapter 11. It's Objects, Tokens for Eigenbehaviors. So this book was published like at around, I think, 2003. And it's from his work, in the past. So like it was pretty close to his death. And but the point is that this is well before sort of the modern era of large language models and other things like that. So this is the article, chapter 11, Objects, Tokens for Eigenbehaviors. And there's a star here. I don't know what it refers to. Okay, this contribution was originally prepared for and presented at the University of Geneva in 1976 on occasion of Jean Piaget's 80th birthday. The French version of this paper appeared in a different volume. So Jean Piaget's 80th birthday, of course, Piaget is a developmental person, and he, of course, developed Piagetian methods for looking at development. So that's interesting that he's kind of connected to that. And so this is a seed, alas, not yet a flower, for Jean Piaget to his 80th birthday from Heinz von Forester with admiration and affection. And so, sorry, I don't know if they were roasting Jean Piaget, but basically that's, it was roasting with papers. So I shall talk about notions that emerge when the organization of sensorimotor interactions, and also that of central processes, which are these anatomical structures, anatomical loops. So, there's this whole idea of sensorimotor interactions being the sensorimotor loop, which is this closed loop feedback system that includes different structures in the human brain, such as the cortical cerebellar spinal system and the cortical thalamic spinal system, is seen as being essentially of circular or more precisely recursive nature. So of course we have these closed loop feedback systems where you have sensory inputs, you act upon those sensory inputs, you get feedback from the body, from the sensory systems, and then you act again. And you have this sort of circular nature, circular causality that emerges from that. You also have this recursive aspect because, like some sort of for loop or some sort of other programming structure, you have things that sort of, processes get kicked off within these loops and persist, and they're regulated by the loop, so they're regulated by past actions, and basically you can reproduce actions, and you have this recursive aspect to it. So he focuses on recursion. Recursion enters these considerations whenever the changes in a creature's sensations are accounted for by its movements. And so he proposes SI equals SMK, which is this idea that the sensations are linked to movements, and movements by sensations, MK, MSJ. So you have two functions, SMK and MSJ, and those lead to SI and MK. So you have movements and you have sensations, and they're interacting, they're coupled terms basically. So you can see that here. When these two accounts are taken together, they then form recursive expressions, that is, expressions that determine the states, movements, sensations of the system. So movements and sensations are different states. So if I have a sensation of touching some object, I have this, maybe the previous experience of looking at the object, this intention to go touch the object, so I go grab it and touch it, and I verify that the object exists, and that gives me more sensory information, and so those things are related in this closed loop feedback system. And then expressions that determine the states of the system, the creature, which is just kind of where the system is embodied in terms of these various states. One point that with more time, effort, and space can be made rigorously and not only suggestively, as it has been made here, that is what is referred to as objects. And then he has this term, Gegenstände, some German term, against standards. In an observer excluded, and he has in parentheses, linear open epistemology. So this is where we have this no observer involved. Appears in an observer included, circular and closed epistemology as tokens for stable behavior. So this is where we have this loop, which doesn't have an observer, and then we add an observer. So when we have this no observer, it's a linear open system. When we have an observer, it's a circular and closed. And then this is like a token for stable behavior. Or if the terminology of recursive function theory is used, tokens for eigenfunctions. So he makes this connection between sort of stable behaviors and eigenfunctions. And then he's using this term tokens, which of course we use in machine learning all the time, in large language models. And that's kind of an interesting aspect of this loop, is that you have these tokens that are doing things that are kind of independent units in this sort of complex system. Of the many possible entries into this topic, the most appropriate one for this occasion appears to me the recursive expression that forms the last line on page 63 of Piaget's Équilibration des structures cognitives, which is the the equilibrium structures of cognition. And then this is the term here, observer O leads to observer S, leads to coordination S, coordination O, observer O, etc. So this is a loop starting in observer O, going to observer S, and then coordination of S, coordination of O, observer O, and then you continue through that loop, and so it just loops around. So it's basically observations lead to coordination in these different aspects of or different components of cognition. So I told you this is a roast of Piaget, basically, for his birthday. This is an observer's account of an interaction between a subject, S, and an object or set of objects, O. So if you recall that second-order cybernetics is this attempt to add the observer into the loop. So you have the loop, the closed loop system, and then you have the observer that's kind of outside, but it's not really outside. It plays an integral role in integrating this loop so that it's not sort of self-referential and doesn't have any sort of intelligent correction or whatever you might call it. So like in the context of a sensorimotor loop, you might have this closed loop between sensation and movement, and then you have this sort of online correction mechanism that supervises that loop to make sure that it doesn't sort of run into sort of a self-referential set of collisions. So, you want to make sure that things don't collide or become, what do you call it? That they don't self-contradict. So this is, so we have these objects, we have these subjects. So in this term up here, we have an observer object, we have an observer subject. We coordinate the subject, which coordinates the object, which then leads to an observation of the object, and so on and so forth. The symbols used in this expression, defined on page 59, stand for, and then they refer to figure 1, which is this crude drawing of observer S, observer O, coordinate S, coordinate O, and this is all in French. Basically, this is an agent with an eye and a hand. That's about it. But it's an embodied agent, which is the subject. Coordination, which is coordinate S, coordinate O. That's the objective of the agent. There's this observation of S, which is this hand. Observation of O, which is the object. This is the observer here, which then coordinates this whole process. And I don't know what this looks like in terms of a brain circuit, but you might imagine that there's like, the actual feedback loop, and then there are other centers that kind of modulate that. And that's what we're dealing with the observer. Now, in the paper that we just put out on the Evergood regulator theorem, we talk about observers, and we talk about their role in these closed loop systems. We talk about a system in the world and a model of that system, and how that model can approximate that system. And when you're talking about something like world models, you're talking about a model that tries to approximate a system, but it has to do so in a way that is generalizable, and but it has to acquire that information from the system. So it can't just simply start modeling the system right away. It has to build up to that. You have to construct a model, and the way you construct a model, of course, is you train it with data. But you can't get all the way there just by training the model, because obviously if we had all the data that we could get for a specific system, then we could basically, we don't even really need to have, we don't need to talk about world models, don't even need to talk about regulation. We just know that you have this model that approximates the world, and if you just train it with enough data, you're done. And we don't have the problem that we need to that we have in modern machine learning, which is we can't necessarily approximate out of distribution events. We can't approximate rare events, things like that. And so we need to have this system that generalizes things. And that's where the observer comes in. The observer sort of supervises that process. It adds in context, and it does other things. Now, I have to say that in our paper, we haven't really dealt with this issue of being specific as to what those components are, only that that's the framework that we need to use. And so, you might think of the observer, or actually you might think of the object as something in the world, like a system in the world. You might have the subject, which is acting upon that information. So the subject is the model, the object is the system in the world. The object is generating data for the subject to pick up and incorporate into its own internal model. But that internal model is only going to be based on the things it can observe. If this ball, for example, behaves in a weird way that's not expecting, then it can't immediately respond to it. It has to kind of learn those behaviors, but then it still has to kind of find out where it fits in the scheme of things. And that's where your observer is important for online correction or things like that. So there's this relationship where the observer might be a symbolic model. It might be some other type of model, meta model, that kind of reinforces these trends on the internal model of the subject. In any case, so this is just kind of talking about the different types of things. The observables related to the action of the subject, the observables related to the object, the coordination of actions or of operations, the coordination of objects, and then this etc., which is an important sort of point here. and they don't have it in the figure, but it's the syntactic injunction to iterate with no limits specified, the sequence of these operations, HVF. So there's a lot of undefined jargon in this article, so I'm not going to get into that. But basically, you have this sort of syntax element, you have this sequence of operations element, and you have this iteration function, which we don't know what those are, but basically it's kind of thinking ahead in terms of this figure and what this will look like over time. So then, for the sake of brevity, I propose to compress the symbolism of before even further, compounding all that is observed into a single variable. So observation of object, observation of subject is compressed into a single variable observation, and compounding coordinating operations that are performed by the subject. Coordination of subject, coordination of object into a single operator chord. Chord, which is the single operator now, transforms, rearranges, modifies the forms, arrangements, behaviors observed at one occasion. So this is where we have this coordination of one time point. And so this is where you can do a lot of things with this. You can transform it, you can rearrange it, you can modify it. It's almost kind of like maybe like a recombination operator in a genetic algorithm or something like that. If you're thinking of building a sort of a genetic algorithm like representation of cognitive processing, this is where you're sort of transforming the sensory data into different shapes or forms. You might reverse it, you might randomize it, and then teach your model about those sorts of transforms, those sorts of deformations of data. And then you have more information about the world than you otherwise would, because you say, well, you're observing in this order, but really it can occur in many different orders. It can occur randomly, or you have to distinguish it from being random, or you have to distinguish it from being backwards, or maybe it occurs in a backwards order. And so you present that to the model, and the model knows what that is, and it eventually kind of understands that there's either this difference or this sort of extension. So that's an important kind of part of this model as well. So chord transforms things at one occasion into those observed at the next occasion. Express the outcome of this operation through the equality, which is this equality here. Observation at time 1 coordinates observation at time 0. Okay, so that's basically it. This footnote here, 1, by replacing the arrow, whose operational meaning is essentially to indicate a one-way or semantic connectedness. Like things like in linguistic terms, it's things like goes to, implies, invokes, leads to. These are expressions that sort of point towards connectedness. And we, of course, will take things in the world, describe objects or relations to objects in terms of semantic content. So that's what we're getting at here. We're looking at different connectedness between adjacent expressions, with the equality sign providing the basis for a calculus. However, in the order that legitimate use of this sign can be made, the variables observe 1 must belong to the same domain. The choice of domain is, of course, left to the observer, who may wish to express his observations in the form of, for instance, numerical values, vectors representing arrangements, or geometrical configurations, or as observations of behaviors in form of mathematical functions. So these could be things like the equations of motion, or biological propositions, which are things, one construct is from McCulloch Pitts. In 1943, they proposed this idea of the temporal propositional expression, or TPE. And we're going to go back to McCulloch Pitts later, but for right now, that's just something that he's putting in this footnote. Well, some relational fine structure is clearly lost in this compression. Gained, however, may be an easiness by which the progression of events suggested on the last line of page 62 and copied here cannot be watched. So this is just basically the sequence that Piaget proposed, and then it's just kind of things that are flipped around or pathways through this set of things that happen. So this is the information processing. You have this observation function, which moves the coordination function. The sort of the S function moves observation of S function moves the coordination of X function. Observation of O function can interact with the observation or the coordination of S function, and coordination of O leads to the observation of O. And all these things kind of move to the next time point. So you have the observation and coordination of S at time 0, influencing the observation of S at time 1. The observation of O at time 1 influences the observation of S at time 1. And so you have these relations. You not only have this closed loop system, but you have this temporal evolution, which is kind of mediated by this observer. And so this kind of goes through this. Allow the operator chord to operate on the previous outcome to give sort of this recursive correction or this recursive recombination. And then this just operates over recursion, where we get this complex system where over enough time we go from observation O, we get this coordination function, and we have observation N. And we can scale this up, so let N grow without limit, so that we have this limit to infinity of coordination of different observations, leading to observations over infinity. So, but what they're basically doing here is they're taking the small kernel of observation and coordination and scaling it up to a bunch of observations and coordinations of different things over time, over unlimited time. So it's almost like just thinking about like how we train AI models today. If we just trained a model, kept training it and training it and training it, we could get this to this observation limit of infinity. But we also need to have the observer in the loop to reach this observation of infinity that actually means something. So, I mean, that's what I'm getting out of this. They're basically proposing a lot of these things kind of way before their time, or at least their technical implementation time. But the point here is that the independent variable obs S, the primary argument has disappeared, which may be taken as a signal that the simple connection between independent and dependent variables is lost in indefinite recursions, and that such expressions take on different meaning. So one point that we brought up in the presentation to the Active Inference Institute, I think in 2024, was that if you have a cybernetic system, because you have this recursion, and if you build a big enough system, you have recursion that becomes very complex, especially when you have a lot of interactions between these loops, is that you lose linear causality, and that it gets swallowed up by this recursive aspect of the system, and that you actually can lose the connection between independent and dependent variables. You can also have really unique forms of recursion, unique forms of causality. So this is really kind of speaking to that, and it's really kind of, way if you built like a very large cybernetic system, not just this first order closed loop feedback, but maybe like a multiple order open loop feedback with observers in the loop, that you can have these kinds of variable types of causality, and you can have, interesting things emerge from those kind of systems. So this just goes on to continue on and talking about how you build these system ups from a simple closed-loop feedback system to infinity, and this just kind of builds upon that. So note that while in this form of the expression has disappeared, all the expression in chord are finite, a new feature has emerged, namely that the dependent variable, observation infinity, is, so to say, self-depending or self-defining or self-reflecting through the operator chord. So this variable observation infinity, which is the sum total of the entire system, is dependent on this chord operator, which of course is operating within the loops, and it's being self-defined by the chord operator, but the chord operator itself is dependent on sort of what's going on in these local observations. And so that's kind of interesting. And if you think about it, it's just merely a time series of a closed loop feedback system. Chord is operating sort of at each time point, the chord operator, but then the outcome over a long period of time is dependent on things that aren't defined until the initial interaction occurs. So it's just kind of this weird kind of causality that is hard to disentangle and hard to say do things like audit the operation of it. And you think about like evolutionary algorithms, and you go back to that, and you say, well, in evolutionary algorithms, we have a mutation operator which changes the initial string, and it can change the initial string in a way that so that when you at the end, your string looks very different than what it started with. And to that I say, we know that like from a lot of experiments in complexity that a lot of these types of operators and feedbacks are can fundamentally transform a system and affect causality. So, looking at a system at the endpoint, it's hard to know what caused something. And, this is kind of all, I'm not going to get into the details here, but we've explored down this path in the literature, especially since this paper was written. So it's a very interesting set of observations from the perspective of this paper because it kind of predicts a lot of those results. Should there exist values, observation infinity I, that satisfy equation 7? So these are these equations up here. Call these values eigenvalues. So now we have this eigenvalue, eigenfunction, eigenoperator, eigenalgorithms, eigenbehaviors. And so it's like, eigenvalues are things you get out of dimensionality reduction analysis. You get eigenvalues for a matrix. And there are ways to summarize complex systems. And so this is where he's going with this, where you have these values that summarize something, some complex vector space or matrix or system. So what he's trying to do, I guess, is extract these eigenbehaviors or eigenvalues from these cybernetic loops, especially when you have a lot of them working in parallel or a lot of them working over time. So this is basically where he's going with this. And I don't want to get too much into this, but there is this nice diagram of the Ouroboros, and they have some unintelligible notation next to it. But basically this is a delta symbol, which is, so you basically have this delta symbol, which is that change is dependent on this closed loop system that is recursive, and then it's hard to disentangle, as we see with the dragon eating its tail, or the snake eating its tail. I don't know what this is. I guess it's a dragon, has feet. But this is the point here. I think it summarizes part of what he's saying, and then there's this other aspect of this coordination operator operating outside of the, or basically the closed loop feedback system, where this coordination operator is coordinating the recursion aspect of it. And then you have this observer or this observation, which is a closed loop. So the observation influences the next observation, and this coordination operator is sort of playing the role of the observer in making sure that those things are internally consistent. In other words, the coordination of compositions, i.e. the whole, corresponds to the composition of coordinations. This is the condition for what may be called the principle of cognitive continuity. So this is where if we have a piece of chalk and we break it apart, breaking pieces of chalk produces pieces of chalk. So this is where we don't transform anything by breaking it into pieces. It's sort of a linear view of cognition where cognition is continuous. You can have like multiple observations and it doesn't fundamentally change the model. You add on to the model basically, or you decompose the model. You don't fundamentally change the model based on continuous feedback. This may be contrasted with the principle of cognitive diversity, which arises when observer I and the composition star are not the eigenvalues in compositions complementing the coordination chord prime, which is chord prime, which is observer 1 and observer 2, or observation 1 and observation 2, and then that's not equal to coordination prime observation 1, coordination prime observation 2. So you're multiplying these two together. The combination of them is not equivalent to the multiplicative outcome of these, or the product of these, in which says that the whole is neither more nor is it less than the sum of its parts. It is different. So this, of course, then again predicts this paper. I think it's more is different. It's sort of a seed paper for the Santa Fe Institute by Anderson. And this is a paper that talks about emergence and how you have, a bunch of different things interacting. And the linear way to describe that would be to add those up and have the sum of the parts described. But emergence is different in that you have a bunch of parts that interact, and then the product of that is more than the sum of the parts. It could be multiplicative. It could be something else that emerges at the next level of organization. And so this is different, where the sum of the parts is not just the sum of the parts. There's this transformation that occurs. And this is different than this idea of cognitive continuity, where if you just have a bunch of observations over time, that you end up sort of with this, we might call it a Bayesian model, because you have this prior distribution of events and you keep updating that prior, and it keeps sort of normalizing your model. In other words, it sort of gets incorporated as a normal mode. And so you end up with something that is sort of approximated down to the proper behavior. So you start with like observations of different things, you're trying to put them together, and over time you get enough observations so that you can see the missing components and you get the picture of the whole. Cognitive diversity, on the other hand, is sort of this idea that you make a set of observations, and as you keep making observations, you don't fill in the entire picture, but you get this emergent property that gives you something different. So in other words, you see these parts, and then eventually you see this whole. It's kind of like the difference if I had a jigsaw puzzle where I started putting in pieces. One aspect of it might be that I want to, I have an idea of what the pattern is, and I'm putting pieces in place from different parts of the puzzle, and I don't know if I have the pattern yet, but my idea is normative. In other words, I'm looking at the different parts and I'm seeing how they're connected and they're drawn together by the sort of mean behavior, and then eventually, as I get enough pieces in place, and I can see that mean behavior, and I can just smooth over everything else and infer what that is. With cognitive diversity, you have these pieces in different places and you're putting them together and you have an idea of what this is, but then when you finally get to the end of the puzzle and get everything in place, you see a totally different pattern. And that's almost maybe more like a semantic aspect of it, because you actually see the meaning in what the pattern is. In any case, I'll leave that here because this is an interesting connection. Remember, this predates more is different. So again, this predates all of the stuff that we know now. Eigenvalues have been found ontologically to be discrete, stable, separable, and composable, while ontogenetically to arise as equilibria that determine themselves through circular processes. Ontologically, eigenvalues in objects, and likewise ontogenetically, stable behavior and manifestation of a subject's grasp of an object cannot be distinguished. In both cases, objects appear to reside exclusively in the subject's own experience of his sensorimotor coordinations, that is, objects appear to be exclusively subjective, under which conditions then do objects assume objectivity. This, it not only talks about some of the things we talk about in second order cybernetics with the observer and how objective the observer is, but also it talks about ontogenetically because Piaget referred to that and referred to ontogeny as this development of this stuff. So you have to remember that from Piaget's perspective, all these systems are developing, or there's a developmental aspect to it. So it's like, emergence is development. The construction of these closed feedback systems are development. We're interested in sensorimotor integration as development. So, sensorimotor integration just doesn't happen at some point, and then, these faculties don't just come online suddenly. They develop. So maybe we have precursor components to these feedback loops, these closed-loop feedback systems, these sensorimotor capabilities. So all that, it doesn't talk about that here, but basically that's the context of what we're talking about. And again, this is another picture of the Ouroboros, where the snake eats the tail of the other as if it were its own, and where cognition computes its own cognitions through those of the other. Here is the origin of ethics. So that's the last line of the paper. And again, we have this, I guess it's two lizards. I don't know if they're snakes, but they have feet. But they're eating each other's tails. And that's the idea behind closed feedback, is that they're eating each other's tails, and it's hard to distinguish between individual components. So a lot of good stuff on like emergence and cognition and computing cognition well before this stuff was given a formal set of terms. So there is this one other thing I want to talk about with respect to this. So this is Warren McCulloch, so it's not Pitts on this paper. And this is in the Bulletin of Mathematical Biophysics in 1945.
You'll have to make that bigger.
Okay, yeah. So this is a heterarchy of values determined by the topology of nervous nets. And Warren McCulloch, he is actually, this University of Illinois College of Medicine is now University of Illinois Chicago. So he was up there. He's also a psychiatrist, or in the Department of Psychiatry. So, this is kind of talking about a little bit more. Now, I don't know if he talks about the term in the 43 paper, but he also talks, very much in the spirit of cybernetics. So because of the dromic character of purposive activities, the closed circuit sustaining them and their interaction can be treated topologically. I don't know what dromic means. Do you know, Morgan?
Sorry, what was that?
What's the word dromic mean?
I mean, no, I'm not. It's not coming to me.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll look it up.
All right. Well, anyways, because of the dromic character of purposive activities, the closed circuit sustaining them and their interaction can be treated topologically. So he's going to take this topological view of what we talked about in the last paper about feedback and these circular systems and these closed circular systems, which are, things that are kind of recursive in nature. It is found that the value anomaly, where A is preferred to B, B to C, but C to A, there corresponds a diadrome or circularity in the net, which is not the path of any drome and which cannot be mapped without a diagonal on its surface sufficient to map the dromes. So
Wow.
dromic is actually a very important term here.
Okay. So it actually is, it is Greek, of course.
Yes.
Dromos, meaning race or running.
Okay.
But I think it is speaking to the race course.
Yeah.
Being circular.
Yeah, I think that would be.
And then so once I push through on that, then go back, because then it's like, doesn't he say bidromic?
Yeah.
So, no, sorry, diadrome. Or circularity in the net.
Yeah.
Which is not the path of any drone.
So I guess what he's saying is that, like, if you have a path from A to B to C, like a transitive path,
Right.
You have like A to B, which is a path, which is a course, and then B to C is a course, and then C to A is a course, and then that's like you have competing courses, and there's a circularity that results because you have this bidirectionality from A to A. You can go outward from A and come inward to A. I guess is what he's saying. But then, of course, this topology is going to be like, if you do an experiment in the real world, you might have like, a choice, forced choice, or a choice experiment where you have some subjects say, do you choose A or B, and then break down your experimental system like that, and then that results in a path of activities, and then that's kind of what he's talking about. So he's mapping like values in terms of things in the experimental world to some sort of pathway of activities. I mean, that's what I'm getting out of this, because I'm trying to think of this in terms of.
Yeah. Well, and diadrome would be a complete course.
Yeah.
Or oscillation of something.
Right.
So it actually can be used associated with a pendulum.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Interestingly, yeah. So I'm getting those great dynamical systems images in my head.
Yeah.
Of closed circuits, or closed paths.
Mm-hmm.
But being dynamic,
right. And again, this is all before dynamical systems was worked out, so they don't have the language that we might have today. But
yeah. I mean, or someone who's just so intimately familiar with the fundamental maths that they're already seeing this.
Yeah. So thus the apparent inconsistency of a preference is shown to indicate consistency of an order too high to permit construction of a scale of values, but submitting to finite topological analysis based on the finite number of nervous cells and their possible connections. So this is what he's doing, what I can gather. He's taking these ideas about, like, if you had a behavioral experiment, or if you had some set of purpose of activities, you say, I prefer A to B, or B to C. You have this sort of transitivity where you have a bunch of things and you're making decisions between them. And of course, they're related through this sort of circularity. So you basically plot everything out topologically, you figure out what the path of preference is, and then you find that there's this loop. And then, of course, you want to map this not necessarily from behavior to some abstract graph or some abstract, representation, but you want to map it to a brain circuit or some nervous system circuit. And so that's what he's thinking about here, where we want to, have this topological analysis of a brain circuit tied to different behaviors, because he's interested in brains and ultimately in this what thing will become connectionism. So
yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm still trying to parse this language. Sorry, can you leave the text up?
Yeah.
Because it's okay. So he's using drone to be the disease.
Drome is the sort of the pathway through. So like you have a pathway through this graph that he's drawing from these different behaviors or these different preferences. Drome is like the path, so it's like moving from one thing to another.
Okay. Sorry.
The diagram then would be circularity, and then he's mapping all this to something of like a nervous system map.
What's the title of
this? The title is a heterarchy of values determined by the topology of nervousness. So heterarchy is another term that, of course, is different from a hierarchy. So heterarchy is something that the cyberneticists used extensively, but what isn't as popular as some of the other terms. And it's basically where you have a system of things that, if you think of a hierarchy, you might have, like, say, A, B, and C. There's a clear sort of order of these things. So, like, A maybe contains B, and then B contains C. So it's a linear hierarchy. And that you might think of that as like like where A is a category of all things, B is a category of like balls, and then C is like a baseball. It's a clear hierarchy. A heterarchy is different, and it's where you have either these non-transitive hierarchies, or you have a system where you have different components that do different jobs, and they're related through these paths. So the dromic aspect is like moving from one path to, or one object to another, and then depending on what part of this path you're in, those things are important at any given time or any given part of the process. Without mapping this to any specific thing, and I'm not going to do that because it's it take me a while to kind of figure out the example. Just think of this as sort of like an alternative to a hierarchy, and then think about these nervous circuits as like the nervous system isn't hierarchical, it's heterarchical, or at least these paths that he's describing. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So what he's trying to get at is the same thing that von Forster was getting at, was looking at closed sensorimotor loops, or in this case, reflex arcs, which are this old thing that Sherrington discovered, and that are kind of the basis for sensorimotor closed loop systems. So if I hit you on the knee, you have this local reflex arc where your leg goes up. If I give you a stimulus in a sensorimotor loop, there's a little bit more control there, but basically you give a response, a behavior and response. So the term reflex originally meant a disturbance which initiated by an extranervous organ, returned by a nervous path to that same organ. So it's like if you have you disturb the sort of equilibrium state by tapping your knee, and then there's a response that comes out of that. Or I guess in the sense of reflex, it's like if I give you a stimulus, you respond to that stimulus. That's a reflex. And then the law of Bell-Magendie that impulses enter the nervous system by dorsal and emerge by ventral roots, which is just the pathways through the nervous system, specified the direction of conduction of these circular disturbances. So again, circular disturbances, the reflex arc, the sensorimotor loops. We're just interested in how we perturb that closed system, sort of semi-closed, of sort of reference. So if we think about the sensorimotor loop that von Forrester talked about, you might have some sensory information coming in, you're acting upon it, and that's a sort of a self-contained thing. It can become inconsistent over time, perhaps. You can perturb that by maybe the observer normalizing things, or you can have some external perturbation which maybe disturbs that whole system. And then, so he's just thinking about the sort of the abstract level here, which is where, you're thinking about this sort of recursive system of feedbacks and self-reference, and then you're thinking about ways to sort of push that around or to perturb it or to correct it in some way. And it's not specific. I mean, it could be specific to anatomy. It could just be like a connectionist system, which has nodes and connections. Circular propagation in this direction was called dromic, and the opposite antidromic. So again, dromic is very important here. With the possible exception of phenomena comparable to that described by Porter, no response of any effector is ever indicated in antidromic reflex, although conduction in the reverse direction has been demonstrated in both the dorsal and ventral roots. So dromic refers to, I guess, specifically to this reflex arc and some of the, so maybe it's a technical term they use in that. So you're propagating something in a certain direction within the loop. And if you're going forward, it's dromic. If you're going backwards, it's antidromic. And, beyond that, I'm not going to get into that. What that actually means in terms of what the outputs of the network are, or the loop. The term reflex has laterally been used of any activity in which one pylon was extraneural, regardless of whether or not it was somatic. Lack of anatomic continuity about the external pylon let aftercomers ignore the essential circularity. All reflexes are dromes, activities of feedback mechanisms, and consequently their function includes all purposive activity. So, I mean, this is really getting deep into kind of jargon and things, but I think the point here is I wanted to make is to say that these circular systems in the von Forrester paper, he formalizes things in terms of cybernetic regulation, can map to these sort of nervous nets and what's going on in the brain and things like reflexes and reflex arcs. And, and again, this is our guy without the shirt. And so he's really interested in building what would then become neural networks. So I don't think he knew about neural networks at the time, but basically a lot of his work would go on to that. So McCulloch is really kind of, thinking about these kind of system level aspects of the reflex arc. Their temporal importance in determining the formal properties of nervous activity have been previously discussed. This is the McCulloch and Pitts paper in 1943. Concerning endodromes as well as reflexes, it is well to recall that given feedback circuits may be regenerative for one temporal combination of excitations and degenerative for another. So these loops in the brain or in a nervous system or in a simulated or artificial nervous system, they're not persistent necessarily. Sometimes they are regenerated over time and sometimes they degenerate into nothing. So you get these loops that maybe are transient. Sometimes they persist over long periods of time. And so we don't really know why that is. We just know that happens. And so any number of parallel circuits may be utilized by a single drome, and these circuits may divide and unite without the disturbance ceasing to be dromic. So this is kind of the idea of heterarchy. So hierarchical system would argue that, or if we had a hierarchical system here, we would have a main circuit and then components, subcomponents of the circuit, or we might have one circuit that coordinates all other circuits underneath. In a heterarchy, of course, we can have these transient loops that kind of exist in different parts of the network and that sort of contribute to the overall output. So there is no one driver, there is no one sort of control system. It's just kind of locally emergent. And this is kind of, again, they don't have the language for this yet, but that's basically what we're doing here. And so we're interested in disturbances. We're interested in these directional movements within these nervous nets and their pathways, and then we're interested in maybe their persistence and how they're contributing to the overall output of behavior. So this is a figure here, figure 1. It shows, again, these are just all line drawings. This shows the central nervous system, an excitatory synapse, a receptor. So we have this loop where we have a synapse and a receptor. We have this continuous line or nervous portion of path. So there's this procession of time and processing over time. We have the afferent peripheral neuron, which is the receptor, the efferent peripheral neuron, which is the effector, and we have this broken line, which is the nervous, somatic, or environmental portion of the path. So if we think about this top part of the diagram, it's basically the inside of the agent, this reflex arc, or this sensorimotor processing that happens within the brain or wherever it is inside the agent. You have the receptor here, so information comes into the agent. It gets processed in some central nervous system, and then it gets executed as behavior through an effector. And then this broken line, which is nervous, somatic, or environmental aspects, are the sensory information, or in this case, importantly, the perturbation that happens with this to trigger this reflex arc. So you have this information coming in the receptor, but you also have perturbations that affect the output in linear and nonlinear ways. So I think that's enough for this paper. Yeah, I mean, it's jargon filled and it's maybe unclear to the modern eye, but basically you're building this cybernetic case for intelligent behavior from networks, and this is all very important, I think, to artificial neural networks, to thinking about our modern conception of behavioral feedback, and then how this is regulated, and maybe that's useful to systems neuroscience.